If someone were to if someone were to ask us about our current experience of ourself, most of us would respond, I am a man or a woman. I am 32, 54 or 76 years old. I am English, Japanese or Swedish. I am tired. I'm happy. I'm lonely. I am at peace. I am bored. I am cold. I am concerned about my child. I am missing my companion, etc. The list goes on almost ad infinitum. In each of these statements, there is a basic feeling of existence, a basic feeling of being that we formulate as I am, which is subsequently qualified by various temporary states, feelings, qualities, or conditions. The states, feelings, qualities, or conditions are always changing. I'm not always 36 or 57 years old. I'm not always tired or lonely. I'm not always at peace. I'm not always missing my companion or concerned about my child. It is even possible to change one's nationality and gender. None of the qualities, states, feelings or conditions are essential to us. But there is one element of experience that is essential to us. Our basic feeling of being. Our fundamental existence, which we formulate by simply saying, I am. The qualities, states, feelings, or conditions that we attribute to what we essentially are always changing within our own experience. And they are always different for each of us. No one is now experiencing exactly the same thought, feeling, sensation, or perception. If we were all to write a brief essay of our current objective experience, there would be 120 different descriptions. But if we were all to write a brief statement about our essential feeling of being, there would be 120 identical statements. The basic feeling of being is the only experience that we all have in common, that is the same for all people, at all times, in all places, and under all circumstances or conditions. Moreover, the basic feeling of being remains the same for each of us throughout our lives. If each of us had written a statement about our objective experience when we were 5, 10, 20, 30 years old, etc., each statement would be very different. But if each of us had written a statement about our essential feeling of being, aged 5, 10, 20, 30, etc., each of our statements would be identical. The basic feeling of being, which we formulate by simply saying, I am, is always the same. It is colored by experience, but never essentially changed by experience. We are not always tired. We are not always lonely. We are not always 36 years old. We are not always happy. We are not always married. But we always are. I always am. So say to yourself now simply, I am. And go to the experience to which those words refer. In other words, discern amidst your experience, thinking, imagining, feeling, sensing, perceiving, your essential being. Be aware of the essential feeling of being. Now when I say go to, discern, or be aware of the essential feeling of being, who would I be addressing? Who or what would go to, discern, or be aware of the feeling of being? Each of us knows for absolute certain that I am. What is it, or who is it, that knows that I am? Is it I that knows that I am? Or is my own being known by something other than itself? It is obviously I that knows that I am. Now, is the I that knows that I am the same I that I am? Or is it a different I? Are there two I's in myself? One, the I that I am, and another, the I that knows that I am. It is obvious that the I that I am is the same I that knows that I am. In other words, our essential being is aware of itself. Our essential being is aware of its own existence. I know that I am. In other words, our essential being is self-aware, self-knowing, or self-illuminating. That is, it knows itself by itself. The sun that illuminates is the sun that is illuminated. The self that knows is the self that is known. just as the sun does not have to do anything special. In other words, just as the sun does not have to direct the rays of its light in any particular direction in order to illuminate itself. So our self doesn't have to do anything special in order to know itself. Just as the sun illuminates itself simply by being itself, so our self knows itself just by being itself. This is why Ramana Maharshi said the highest meditation is simply to be. Before our essential self-aware being knows any objective knowledge or experience, it knows itself. In other words, its knowledge of itself is its primary, most fundamental knowledge. The common name for our essential self-aware being is awareness. The suffix ness simply meaning the presence of or the being of. Thus awareness means the presence of or the being of that which is aware. The common name for this self-aware being is I. In other words, our knowledge of ourself. The knowledge that I am is awareness's knowledge of itself. And awareness's knowledge of itself is the only knowledge that remains the same in all states, under all conditions, in all circumstances, and at all times and places. It is thus said to be absolute knowledge. in awareness's knowledge of itself. That is, in the simple knowing of our own being. There are no qualities, characteristics, feelings, conditions. And therefore there are no limits. In other words, awareness's knowledge of itself is unlimited. It is only with the arising of objective knowledge or experience that our essential irreducible being seems to become qualified and therefore limited. But in awareness's knowledge of itself, in the simple knowing of our own being, there is nothing in itself other than itself with which it could be conditioned and therefore limited. In other words, the simple knowledge, I am, is our own being's knowledge of its own self-aware, unlimited or infinite self. The religious name for this unlimited or infinite self-aware being is God. In other words, God's presence shines in each of us as the knowledge I am. This is why Rumi said, I searched for God and found only myself. I searched for myself and found only God. our knowledge of ourself is God's knowledge of Himself. There is no distance from ourself to ourself. There is no distance from the I that knows to the I that is known. And therefore there is no room for a path, a method, or a practice. The place where we start and the place where we end is the same place. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. What we call the beginning is often the end. When we make an end, we make a beginning. The end is where we start from. T.S. Eliot. There is no path from I am to I am. There is no path from myself to myself. the origin, the path, and the goal are the same. There is no room for any effort from myself to myself. And therefore no room for a separate self to practice or do anything or go anywhere. That's why Ashtavakra said, for the sage, even blinking is too much trouble. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. I am is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through the knowledge I am, except through the knowledge I am. I am is the origin, the path, and the goal. That's why the Sufi mystic Balayani said, I knew my Lord through my Lord. the only self that is present, if we can call it a self, is God's infinite being. And God's infinite being cannot be known by anything other than itself. There is no other self present that could either know or not know God's infinite being. No one sees him except himself. No one reaches him except himself. No one knows him except himself. He knows himself by means of himself. He reaches himself by means of himself alone. No one but he knows him. Balayani. The knowledge I am is infinite consciousness shining in each of our finite minds. The feeling of being is God's presence shining in each of our hearts. The name I, or I am, is God's holy name in each of us. Thus the name I or I am is the highest mantra. Keep the name I or I am sacred. Every time you think it or say it, follow it. Follow the name I or I am like Ariadne's golden thread. To your infinite self-aware being. Be uncolored, transparent, empty, luminous, unlimited self-aware being that resides not just behind all experience, although it is often found there first, but shines in the midst of all experience. Don't allow experience to stain, tarnish, or limit what you essentially are. Or rather, see clearly that experience does not stain, tarnish, or color what we essentially are. See that our essential, irreducible, self-aware being shines brightly behind and in the midst of all experience. be open to the possibility that the being that shines in each of our minds as the knowledge I am is the same infinite, indivisible, self-aware being, refracted through the prism of each of our minds into an apparent multiplicity and diversity of selves, but never actually ceases to be a single, infinite, indivisible being. Be open to the possibility that the multiplicity and diversity of objects that are known by each of our minds derive their existence from the same infinite, indivisible being, that each of our minds derives its apparent existence from. In other words, be open to the possibility that the isness of all things and the amness of all selves is the same infinite, indivisible being, self-aware being. In other words, be open to the possibility that the Sufis are right when they say there is only God's face. The only difference between what the Sufis say and what I say is that they take a few seconds to say what I take a few hours to say.